Talk to us now and go to the TNT Radio Interactive Live chat room at tntradio.live. Lighting the fuse for freedom. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT. Matt Ehret and connecting the dots on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to Connecting the Dots on TNT for our third hour. As I promised, we have a great guest, somebody who is I've now been he's been on my radar now for about 8-9 months. Read through his book, got to know him. Richard Cook is somebody who has impressed me quite a bit in his method of analyzing history and seeing the connection of the past to the present with a look to the future, and that's always the key. I think a lot of historians, they frustrate me because they tend to compartmentalize their minds in unnecessary ways. They treat the past as if it's like something disconnected because it's so far removed, right? Many people, generations have died in between our lives today and what Benjamin Franklin was doing, Washington, Hamilton, other people were doing 250 years ago. What does that mean? Whereas when I was reading through your writings, you don't have those problems. And you also understand that we are living in history. And that context is everything, that the future is going to look back and learn from us. Were we tragic? Did we give into mediocrity and stupidity? Did we become better people when we needed to be? We don't know, because a lot of this is subjective, right? It's depending on our decisions. So Richard Cook, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to talk to you today about a little bit of your book, a little bit of your thesis, your method of thinking, and also your new think tank.
Right. Good. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Cool. So first of all, let's start with Our Country Then and Now. Let's do that, because this is a book that people should read. They should have this on their bookshelf. It's a good resource. Like I said, it's a healthy approach to history that doesn't make the mistake of either just treating America's past as being all crap and hypocrisy and empire and evil and destruction, although you don't ignore those things. And
Right.
you don't just treat it like a giant fluff piece saying everything America did was great,
Right.
and just ignore all the evil. So you're able to do what not many people I notice do well, and you were able to navigate through that middle ground and see that, okay, there's something really beautiful, but there's also certain really bad things as well that we should also
Right.
be aware of, because if we're not, we won't understand today's deep state and what's
Right.
causing America to self-destruct. So what went into your mind going into this? Like what do you want as a takeaway from people who've studied your book?
Well, first of all, I'm a resident and a citizen of the United States. I spent 32 years working for the federal government. I worked for 5 different agencies, including the Carter White House. I worked at NASA when Challenger blew up. And I just happened by coincidence to have a batch of papers that showed why that happened, that I leaked to the newspapers. So I went through all that whistleblower thing. And then I spent over 20 years kind of hiding out in the US Treasury Department. And I tell you, that was an education. I ended up actually developing and teaching training courses on the history of the US monetary system. And that took me back to colonial days, to Indian wampum, to Spanish dollars, all the way through the 19th century and all of the controversies there, including Lincoln's issuance of the greenbacks, which he called a true people's currency, which was perhaps the last big episode in the attempt to develop a people's currency to serve the growing United States. Then we had the Federal Reserve System that came in 1913. And increasingly, I'm referring to that event as the insurrection of 1913, when a very alien system was brought into the United States, a central banking system based upon fractional reserve banking, which needs some explanation for a lot of people, and the practice of usury, that is the use of interest on lending by a private enterprise authorized to create money out of thin air that mainly ends up in their own pockets. And that's been the system under which we have been operating ever since then. And in the second half of my book, the first half I kind of do the history leading up to that. The second half is the consequences of that. Endless warfare, endless cycles of asset inflation followed by recession or depression, corruption of every aspect of the political and economic system, endless wars to keep the rest of the world under the thumb of the money power. And then the creation of what we've all learned to call the deep state, which is kind of the behind the scenes operators in charge of color revolutions, in charge of regime change. And we see that very active today in both Europe and the Middle East. So anyway, I just try to tie all of these things together. But as you said, history is alive in all of us today. And as you were talking, Matt, I realized that since my first European ancestors came to America, which was in the year 1638, and that doesn't count my Native American ancestors who entered the family through my French Canadian grandfather and his family, that's only 14 generations. Now, it seems like a long time, but think of that. 14 people is not a whole lot of people. And everything that we are looking at today, at least in my own case, came through the hands and lives of 14 generations of people. The past is not that far behind us, and it's living in us all today. And I'm very closely in touch, for example, with the Native Americans in Montana. I was born in Montana, actually, near the Flathead Indian Reservation. And my grandfather worked for the Forest Service out there. My mom grew up in the woods of Montana and became a nurse. And all of that history is very alive today. And we're seeing tragedies today out there. We're seeing the infiltration of Montana, and particularly the seven great Indian reservations, by drug gangs from Mexico who are creating havoc among the indigenous people of my home state, and also, I'm sure, up in Canada as well. So all of that is kind of rolling down the pike at us, and we have to face up to these things and deal with the problems that the past has left us with. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
And this brings us into the new think tank that you created, the new institute, what's called the American Geopolitical Institute, which is brand new. I think you set this thing up maybe a week and a half ago or something like that.
Right.
I know I was very impressed by your general mandate when I looked at the press release.
Right.
The issue of breaking up the crime syndicates that have really
Right.
infiltrated and taken control of so many of the Native American
Right.
reservations, including in Canada. I mean, this is a thing.
Yeah.
Um, where does this come from? So my first question would be basically, you just brought this up. I was always curious, was this, because this is something I've always known, and I only know the Canadian experience of the reserves. It's
Right.
kind of an unspoken thing that everyone knows. Mafia does huge business there, a
Mhm.
lot of money laundering, drugs, all sorts of things. A
Right.
lot of these reserves, especially on the Canada-US border,
Yeah.
very, very useful for those who don't like, who need this. Anyway, was this baked into the construction of the reserves from the get-go, or is this something that was brought in over time as far as using them to keep the natives in a state of underdevelopment and keep their territory used for corruption's sake? How do we understand that, and how do we do something about that? It's a big problem.
Yeah. It's a very complex history to that. And I think the people who read my book, I write about the general history of the Indian way of life, going back to really ancient history when before the Europeans came, and trace that until today. But I do it primarily through a study of the Flathead Indian tribes in western Montana. This is a place, the Flathead Reservation is a place that my mom and dad went to when they were kids growing up. It was a part of the culture out there. And I made several trips to Montana in the last 3 years to meet with people, interview people, get to know the history. And basically, when the United States took over the Oregon country in 1855, when they made the treaty with Great Britain that, drew the line between Canada and the United States, the United States set up what they call the Washington Territory. And that included western Montana up to the Continental Divide. And a guy named General Stevens was tasked by Washington to go into the Washington Territory and to put all of the Native American tribes onto reservations. And they did that in Montana, in western Montana, by signing what they call the Hell Gate Treaty.
Approximately
Now,
what year was this, thereabouts?
About 1855. Okay. I think the treaty was 1853. The Hell Gate Treaty was signed just 2 years later in 1855. And Hell Gate is an actual geological location just outside the city of Missoula, where I was born, where the Clark Fork River comes down from the Continental Divide through a canyon out into the Columbia River Basin, where all the rivers from western Montana flow into. So they created a reservation there, which they called the Flathead Reservation, which was the generic name for the Indian tribes of that area. And it consisted of two parts. The northern part, which is today's Flathead Reservation, is 12.5 million acres. Now, that's a big piece of land. That's bigger, for example, than the state of Delaware. The southern half was in the Flathead River Valley. The Bitterroot River Valley. And the provision there was that over time, the Indians in that area would migrate north to the Flathead Indian Reservation. And that's actually what happened. But in the Flathead Reservation, where about half a dozen different tribes were located, they actually had a pretty good life after the signing of the treaty, because they had hunting rights on and off the reservation. They had a lot of land for grazing their cattle, and their chiefs had a lot of wisdom, and they made a decision: we will not fight the U.S. government and engage in warfare against the U.S. Army. We will accept what we're given and move on from there. And that's the way they've lived ever since then. And compared to a lot of other Indian tribes, particularly in the West, they're doing pretty well. They've established businesses, industries. But what happened was that in the late 1800s, the federal government decided we're going to get rid of the reservations. This is too good a deal for the Indians. And it's time for us to incorporate the Indians completely into white society and assimilate them into white culture. That's when they started sending kids out to the Indian schools in places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was to get rid of their Indianness and turn them into white people. That was also the philosophy under which the allotment policy came into being. And under the allotment policy, the reservations, and this happened in a lot of different places, including Oklahoma, where they had the land rushes, opened the land to white settlement. And so they actually had lotteries where white people could move onto the reservation and take the land that had been set aside for the Indians. This began in Montana, in western Montana, in 1910. And immediately, the Indians began to decline into poverty because they could no longer raised their cattle and horses on open range. Hunting was restricted because the whites and their farms drove away the animals that they hunted, because they were still hunting moose, antelope, deer. It was a tragedy for the Indians. And I document that in my book in great detail for the Flathead tribes. This went on for a quarter century. Then, when Roosevelt was elected president, he had a commissioner of Indian Affairs who actually said the old Indian way of life, in its morality, in its ethics, in its relationship to the earth, was superior to the white way of life. Wow. And so they created a new system of tribal government, tribal councils, where the Indians themselves gradually began to take over administration of their land. And what we have out there today is this system of government that was set up in 1934 under the Indian Reorganization Act, where the Indian tribal councils themselves ran the Indian governments. And everything we have today on these reservations stems from that, including an Indian police system where they have the right and the responsibility to police their own land, their own societies. They have an Indian court system, but when half the population or more living on the reservation are white people who have allegiance to the county government and the state government, you've got a recipe for trouble. And so all of this has never been really sorted out in these reservations. So anyway, that's just kind of an overview of
that's good, because that creates the I guess the fertile soil for the later implanting of these different points of corruption. So without this context, without this history, one couldn't possibly address the question that I wanted to address, which is like, how did all of these international mafia, crime syndicate cartels end up Albanian mafia and Mexican mafia and all these things? So this helps immensely. I'm not going to belabor you with more details, but this is very vital.
One last point that's in the news today. The Indian tribes, to staff and train and support in a court system a adequate police presence to keep the drug cartels out of the reservations, they don't have the resources.
Yeah.
And the state of Montana and the county governments say they don't have the resources, and so they just stay out of the way while the drug gangs come in and corrupt the Indian reservations. And so that's kind of the rest of the story.
Of course, yeah, you keep somebody in a state of want, and of course, you're going to increase the chances that they will become corrupt or take bribes or whatever else, of course, because there's no abundance, there's no opportunity. So of course, it makes sense. That's the case of Ukraine or anybody who's been through the IMF breakdown. On this note, let's go for a quick commercial break. We're going to come right back with today's News Talk TNT.
TNT's Mark Morano.
Breaking news. Climate punks trash the U.S. Constitution at the National Archive Rotunda in Washington, D.C.
We are determined to foment a rebellion. We will not be held accountable to laws in which we have no voice or representation.
The entire U.S. archive was evacuated because of this stunt. And did you notice our men in blue and women in blue stood around and enabled these protesters to not only deface the case of the U.S. Constitution was held, but also to quiet the crowd, it seemed like, and just allow them to speak. It's almost as if, hey, they have the floor, everyone, let's be quiet. We have some vandals here that want to speak. Let's give them our due respect that they've earned.
Mark Morano on today's News Talk TNT.
When I had my heart event close to 4 years ago, I was at the gym, thought I deserve a coffee, and thought I'll top up with fuel, ordered a coffee. But while I was pumping fuel, I started to get chest pains. Then it got worse and worse and worse. So then I was leaning on the counter thinking, yeah, something's not quite right. So then I went to wait for the coffee, and that's when it really, really hit. And Joy just, mouthed, do you need an ambulance? And I remember nodding. I wasn't even thinking about a heart attack. I just thought something is seriously wrong with me here. So when the cardiologist came to see me, she informed me that I'd had what they call a widowmaker heart attack. Bit of a shock when someone says, you nearly died. Everybody should be aware of all the symptoms of a heart attack that women can have that aren't typical of the shoulder pain, the right arm pain. I go to the gym, I do yoga, Pilates, I swim, I go on bike rides, and yet I still had a heart attack. You just don't know it could be you.
The human mind is like a computer, no matter how efficient it may be. Its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it.
That's a campaign promise.
Tell us the truth. Tell us the truth.
We mandate that the truth be told.
You're hearing it.
TNT.
All right, welcome back for the second segment of the third hour on Connecting the Dots. I'm here joined by Richard Cook, founder of American Geopolitical Institute, author of Our Country Then and Now, which people should buy. Google it on Amazon, get it wherever you can, just get it. Richard, I have a question. So you had brought up in our previous segment your support for the greenback system of Lincoln.
Right.
And I've looked at your Geopolitical Institute. One of your mandates is to restore a national bank, break up monopolies for these. But you're also against the Federal Reserve. Now, a lot of people I encounter would say, "Oh, but the Federal Reserve is a national bank." Right. How? Obviously, I know that's a misguided opinion, but it's common. It's out there. So, how do you respond? What is the difference between the Federal Reserve and a real national bank, the type of which a Lincoln was fighting to bring online? What's the difference between the two, or that you're fighting to bring online?
Well, I'll try to be succinct with this because books have been written about it, including my book, where I really go into great detail about where the Federal Reserve came from and what it became. But basically, the Federal Reserve system was created by what we call the money trust. And that was the big private bankers who had pretty much taken over the American economy by the late 1800s and early 1900s. The big name in all this was J.P. Morgan. It's useful to think of Morgan as kind of the focal point of this, but Morgan was very closely allied, in fact, so was his father, with the private bankers of England and of Europe, mainly France and Germany. And the big name in private banking in Europe, of course, was the Rothschild family. And it was the Rothschilds who were the European partners of J.P. Morgan and the Money Trust. And the private banking system under Morgan had become so powerful that by the early 1900s, it was the actual owner of much of American industry, including the steel industry, because it was Morgan who came in and essentially bought out Carnegie and became the de facto owner of U.S. Steel, and then the owner of the Steel Trust that included all of the other subsidiaries. Okay, so that was one half of the money trust. The other half was the Rockefellers. And the Rockefellers had been financed, John D. Rockefeller had been financed in his creation of Standard Oil by the Rothschild banking interests. So you had the Rothschilds at work on both sides of the track. With the money that Rockefeller made in oil, he created his own series of banks, which became eventually Citibank, Chase Bank, and those kind of things. And today we see how all that came together, because the most powerful bank in the world is the union of the two aspects, the two parts of the money trust, J.P. Morgan, Chase. All of that is a result of the takeover of the banking system by the money trust in the early 1900s. The Federal Reserve is owned by J.P. Morgan Chase. They are the literal owners of record of the banking system that is run out of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They appoint the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, That's the bank that sets the uniform interest rate that affects all banking throughout the US and throughout much of the rest of the world. The United States government has absolutely no say in the setting of that interest rate. That is
There's
set
a video
by
of Alan Greenspan in the early 90s describing how the Federal Reserve is outside of the authority of the federal government when they want to make their
yeah,
decisions. So that was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's not just you saying that. That's actually the chairman of the Federal Reserve just openly saying we make decisions that are unaccountable by the elected aspects of all government. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there.
right, exactly. And they brag about it. Say, oh, we're free of politics. Well, they're free of the control of the elected representatives of the American people. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not what the US Constitution says. The US Constitution says that Congress has the authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof. And that translates all the way down through oversight of the banking system, which even after Lincoln created the greenbacks, we still had a national banking system set up, but it was overseen and supervised by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the features of that system was a bank in any location, and there were at that time thousands of banks that had been set up, could set its own interest rates based upon local conditions. That prerogative of a bank to set interest rates depending on local conditions was taken away by the Federal Reserve legislation and put in the hands of the Federal Reserve System, and specifically the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, because that's where they call it the window for open market operations is. That's where the whole banking system gets its reserve credits from. And that's what Alan Greenspan was talking about. That institution is literally the property of the Wall Street banks, plus some European banks, including the Rothschild banks coming out of England and France. So that's what we mean by a privately owned and operated banking system. And they can lend money for anything. They could lend money for derivative speculation. They can lend money for leveraged buyouts, where a bunch of vulture capitalists come in, buy a company, strip it of assets, and may bankrupt it. But they do that on borrowed money. That's why it's called leveraged buyouts. They borrow money from the Federal Reserve System in order to come in and destroy companies. That's why Toys R Us doesn't exist anymore, because the vulture capitalists borrowed so much money that Toys R Us went bankrupt. And that story has been repeated constantly throughout the last a half century. So anyway, that's just kind of a thumbnail sketch of where we are with this.
I got a quick follow up. There's a few questions popped into my mind as you were speaking, but as a quick point of clarification, I get how if you are, let's say, a vulture fund, or let's say you want to make money off of the destruction of some productive enterprise, so you could short sell, so you could sell short on the stock, presuming that they're going to go down, and then that kind of becomes a Pygmalion effect, like a manifest destiny, because enough people do that, selling short, and all of a sudden that means like this, you're going to cause the stock to tank, but you're going to make money because you knew it was going to happen. We've seen George Soros and his ilk doing stuff like that. So you incentivize the breakdown of the real economy, of real businesses. But what you just said is, does that overlap? Or I have a difficult time seeing how these vulture funds that would get capital as a loan from the Fed or whatever to buy up a otherwise productive or useful enterprise, how do they then make money off of having destroyed and stripped down that company? Where's that?
They don't go directly to the Federal Reserve. They'll go to J.P. Morgan Chase or whatever bank, their big bank, investment bank they're dealing with. They sell the assets. They sell the factories. They sell the inventory.
I got
and that's how it's done. The asset, it's called stripping of assets.
Gotcha.
They then are authorized to leave the debt they incur to do this with the company they're destroying. And that's what happened to Toys R Us. And then the company goes bankrupt. And when a company goes bankrupt, the bank doesn't lose anything because all the bank does, the bank didn't give this vulture capitalist any real money. They created the money as a debit entry in their books and transferred that debit to the vulture capitalist. So when the vulture capitalist walks away, the company goes bankrupt, all the bank does is just crosses it off in their ledger. They don't actually lose any money in doing that because they've created the money originally out of thin air, and now they're just Xing out the account on the ledger. That's
it's just it's a magician's trick using mathematics and people not looking at reality. And
right.
Okay.
Now here's another example of how they do this. You're probably reading now of stock buybacks, where a corporation, instead of issuing new stock, it will actually buy stock on the open market, incorporate that stock into their own ledgers, and that will drive up the stock price, and they'll also drive up executive compensation. We're seeing this happening all the time now. But where did they get the money to buy their stock back? They borrow it from a bank and pay it off the increased profits of their company.
Of course. So it doesn't mean that there's more demand for their product. It means that they're just it's not like they're doing anything good. They're just buying their own stock to raise the value of the stock and then giving themselves bonus for a good job that then pays off the loans that they took out to buy up their stock. Right.
And guess who's doing this? Companies like Lockheed Martin, the big defense company, is actually owned by hedge funds. So the billions of dollars that Congress votes for weapons for Ukraine goes to companies like Lockheed Martin, which they use for stock buybacks to drive up investor profits and executive compensation. They claim they're going to hire a lot of new employees and that this is going to be a boost for the American economy. It's all a lie. It's all done for stock buybacks and executive compensation. So this is just part of the scam.
All right. On this note, let's do this. Let's go for a commercial break. And then I'm going to scratch. You just said some big things. I want to pull on some threads here because these are huge problems. And I'm curious to see what are your thoughts? What would you advise let's say we actually had a government in office that was represented by real human beings that didn't want to go along with the death cult and actually do something about this immense issue. I'm going to let that question just float out there and hang over people's imaginations for a few minutes or a few seconds while we listen to some commercials on TNT News Talk.
With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Timothy Shea.
Americans this week celebrated President's Day. Or did we? The answer, of course, is that we did not. We celebrated George Washington's birthday. And possibly, if you want to include Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, whose birthday, February 12th, was given up for Martin Luther King Day back in the 1980s. But we definitely did not celebrate Millard Fillmore and James Buchanan. We didn't celebrate Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton. And we most definitely did not celebrate Barack Obama and Stumblebum Joe. Why does this matter? Am I just being picayune and pedantic? No, it matters because words matter. George Orwell wrote, "The slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts." Put more colorfully, blurry words carry deplorable thinking the way that mosquitoes carry malaria. You should always question the dominant narrative, whether it's that standard time going into daylight savings time is an artifact from our agrarian past, when in actuality farmers argued against it when the progressives put it in 110 years ago. That the Republican Party and the Democrat Party flipped after the 1960s, when that's demonstrably false. And even that red is the Republican color and blue is the Democrat color, when again, the opposite is true. In fact, the opposite is always true, what the dominant narrative seems to be. So question the words, or else you've lost the argument before it's even begun. From MAGAInstitute.com, this is Timothy Shea for today's News Talk, TNT.
The challenges our planet's animals are facing sometimes feel a bit heavy.
The animals haven't eaten in a day, 2 days, they haven't drank anything, they're cold, they're dehydrated.
As soon as we started our descent, everywhere I could see was mud, just absolutely mud.
The country has been in prolonged drought for so long, it was like a tinderbox waiting to go up.
Okay, very heavy. Each of us wants to be part of the solution, and we can be. Remember that there's good happening right now. At home.
All right, we were able to get into your unit, and we have all 4 of your cats. So,
okay.
And around the world. For any animal in any disaster. So let's focus on that, right? Be part of the solution, one rescue at a time. Search ifa.org/disaster ready.
This is Connecting the Dots with Matt Ehret on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we're back with the third segment of the third hour with Richard Cook, author of Our Country Then and Now, a 400-year journey through America's history, and the president of American Geopolitical Institute. Richard, before the break, you were just going through, you basically broke the spell. You showed us very quickly, succinctly, how the game is played, how nations are stripped of their ability to actually have any claim to real sovereignty and protect their people. What would you say? Let's say we're able to get some human leadership again. Let's say the MAGA groups are able to get their act together and have influence on a federal level. What should a competent government, and I'm speaking also governments maybe in Canada, maybe in Europe, actual real governments, let's say we can get that. What could they do faced with these vulture funds that have been using shell companies, that have been using all sorts of these techniques and tricks to financialize our economy and destroy the real economy? What sort of policies are available to us? What sort of precedents are available to us?
Could I real quickly just say something about the American Geopolitical Institute?
Oh, please do.
We'll get to that. Back when I started writing on these things in 2007, after I retired from the U.S. government, published a book, We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform, lots of articles. But people would say to me, you need an institutional presence in order to get the credibility and the platform you need. And because otherwise, I was just, everything I wrote, I would be shopping to multiple websites and editors and stuff. So finally, the Veterans Today group, which had been reorganized and reestablished as VT Foreign Policy, came along and said, look, we will give you a web page and a presence and an archive capability and those other things that go with, having a real institution. So anyway, we set out to try to do that with them as our platform, and we're very grateful to them. So I'm putting together a stable of writers to support us in that, and that's basically it. We don't have a big fancy building in downtown Washington to lobby from. We just have a few guys out in the boonies. So anyway, there's 2 ways to approach your question, Matt, and it's a fabulous question. Number one, much of what has happened to create the travesties that we have today has been the result of deregulation that set in under the Reagan administration. 1980, the Reagan Revolution was deregulating the economy and putting everything increasingly under the control of the banks. And that meant the Federal Reserve System. So one answer to the question is to reestablish the regulations that were stripped away. One is to outlaw leveraged buyouts. Another is to outlaw stock buybacks, which had been outlawed. A third is to reestablish what the separation between deposit banking and investment banking. It's called the Glass-Steagall regulation that had been put in place under Roosevelt back in the Depression. Many people are saying we have to reestablish Glass-Steagall, including Elizabeth Warren when she was trying to run for president a few years ago. So we have to put back in place regulations that had been stripped away to allow these travesties to occur. So that's one answer to the question. And the people who are in the regulatory agencies know exactly what I'm talking about and could do this tomorrow if Congress weren't completely bought out by financial donors. And so that's a whole nother issue is electoral reform to get money out of the electoral system. And that's one of the points in the platform that we put together. The other is to create a new monetary system. And people have known ever since the Federal Reserve came into being what it meant and what we should have instead of it. And that is to restore governmental control, which is public control, we the people control, a constitutional control over the monetary system. We know how to do that. Lincoln did it using the tools that he had available in his day, which was for the government to spend money directly into circulation by payment of government obligations for things like infrastructure, railroad systems, telegraph systems, soldier pay, salaries of government employees. All of that can be paid directly into circulation by issuance of money by the Treasury. And in fact, there's a whole new movement now by I don't have her name at my fingertips, but out of Harvard, who's putting together a monetary movement called direct payment, where the government recovers the authority to make direct payments instead of having to go through the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is the fiscal agent for the US government. And that's why anything that the federal government does of a financial nature has to go through the Federal Reserve System. And it shouldn't have to do that. What we used to have before the Federal Reserve is called the independent Treasury. And I explained that in my book. So we need to create a new monetary authority that has the authority to directly spend money into circulation for government requirements. The second thing is to control the lending apparatus, where we take control of the banking system, and we either have public banks, such as the Public Banking Institute advocates for, and I've worked with them. I've spoken at their meetings.
Is that the Ellen Brown? That's the Ellen Brown.
Ellen Brown's group, right?
Yeah.
Public Banking Institute, and she cites the Bank of North Dakota as the model for that. Yeah. And there are a lot of places now in the United States that, thanks to their work, are beginning to at least take a look at creating public banks. And the other thing is control of usury. Why would the United States have a system where if you're overdue on your credit card, you're paying 27% interest? It's criminal. Yeah. It's been recognized as criminal by every responsible authority since the Old Testament was written. And there's no difference between then and now. It
blows my mind because people are so quick to freak out about like China social credit scores, blah, blah, blah. And yet here we are living under the most virulent form of social credit that you could ever imagine, where people, you screw up on a credit card payment, you had a bad turn, all of a sudden you get in bad debt, and you're punished for life. You can't buy a car, buy a house, you can't live. Right. It's going to follow you forever. And there's no way out of it, it seems. So just to reemphasize some indignation.
And if you foreclosed on your house, a person may have paid $200,000 for their house, and one bad turn of luck, and they lose the whole asset to the bank. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is criminal. And these practices have to be stopped. And the only way they can be stopped is by, in the United States, or whatever the governing authority is in other countries, takes the authority back. Because the Federal Reserve exists only, and I say only, through an act of Congress. An act of Congress can be rescinded. It can be changed. It could be done tomorrow by the appropriate congressional legislation. And the knowledge is there. I mean, I worked for years with Steve Zarlenga, who was the head of the American Monetary Institute. When I was at Treasury, I helped Steve draft what we call the American Monetary Act. And you can Google that and find out exactly what it says. The American Monetary Act was adopted by Dennis Kucinich when he was in Congress, and he created from that what he called the NEED Act, the National Education and Employment Defense Act, which would put in place a modern government-operated monetary authority that would set up under today's conditions what Lincoln created during the Civil War with the greenback system. And that authority is there. It's on the books of Congress. Any of our listeners can look it up, and it's in my book. In the appendix, there's a whole section there about how this act came about and a number of the resources that are available to learn more about it. But I'm also going to be doing a presentation for the Green Party on April 3rd. Now, the Green Party actually has the NEED Act as part of their national platform. It's the only political party that has adopted monetary reform. And so I'm going to be on a panel with a group of several other people to explain that. But it's right there. It's available. People can look it up. And I say in there in my presentation, people say, well, what do I do? Well, the number one thing to do is to get educated, about all of the things that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
And it's through people like you, Matt, and the other people that we work with that we can try to spread this message that the knowledge exists, the ability exists to do all these things. What we need is the political will, and then it can be done.
No, that's well said. And sure enough, action without knowledge will cause a big mess. Every time that people try to move without fully understanding what they're moving on or what the topography is, they become instruments of their own destruction. And so, yeah, it's very good advice. Do knowledge, mind work, and then put it into action accordingly. Lift small and then lift bigger as you build those metaphysical muscles. That's good advice. One of the points that I often encounter. Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you want to throw back at me something on that point.
And then they come back and say, well, what can I do personally? My answer is get out of debt and stay out of debt. Ben Franklin said, neither a borrower nor a lender be. And that's the best advice, particularly for young people, that anybody could give. Build your own house. My son, Tim, has built 3 houses. Because he got the know-how and the will and did it. And so he isn't saddled with tremendous debt. People can do these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very important to keep that both sort of bottom up and top down approach to life alive at the same time, because people are often very either or, I can either think, you said all these big things about restoring government, breaking down the BlackRock, Wall Street, oligarchical death cult complex, and take back our nation. It's like, but we can't do that. That's so big. It's so corrupt. All I can do is think small. So I'll do that. Or people say inversely, no, don't think small. That's a waste of time. You got to think big. And it's like, wait a minute. Why is this either or thing there? Shouldn't we both take care of ourselves and develop aptitudes personally to build things and know how to, do things competently while at the same time not losing this top-down battle or our relationship to that? No, we can do both. So I really appreciate your walking in both worlds and tuning people's minds to know how to do that as well. Here's a question I have for you, though. On the issue of a lot of the issues of national banking, breaking up the banks, getting rid of the destruction caused by neoliberalism, the whole von Hayek, Friedman, Milton Friedman deregulation of everything, worship money thing that created globalization and all this destruction for 50 plus years. A lot of people will say, I agree with you. That's why I believe in a Green New Deal to create a centralized banking in order to build windmills everywhere. And, you know, we can see how this plays into what Prince or King Charles and Klaus Schwab also want with the Great Reset, ultimately just creating a lot of scarcity with fake infrastructure. How do you help people who like this, but they're weak on the issue of like, well, what sort of infrastructure do you now build that isn't going to play into the mass depopulation agenda, which some people would like, who would like versions of the New Deal or versions of Hamiltonian banking, but with this green depopulation spin?
Right. That's a good question.
And it's only 5 minutes long before we end the show. I'm so sorry. This is a big question. I'm sorry.
Just to be very, very brief about it. Back when the American Monetary Institute was in its prime, they were doing in touch with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers on what the infrastructure deficit was, just to bring the U.S. infrastructure up to a reasonable standard. Fix the bridges, fix the roads, fix the highways.
Like $5 trillion or something, right?
Yeah, it was like a deficit of several $1 trillion. Well, let's start with there. Let's start with fixing what we have. Let's start with fixing our schools. Let's start with salaries for our teachers. And then when we've done that, we'll get into the bigger issues that can really only be decided at the political level through a political process that includes real science, real participation by all affected groups, and then see where that leads us. But there's such a deficit today in what needs to be done, just to take care of what we have. I would put some money into supporting organic farming and gardening, for example. I think that our government totally is in favor of agribusiness and saturating the land with herbicides and pesticides and selling degraded products to foreign countries where we put their farmers out of business. I mean, look at NAFTA, for heaven's sake. Let's take care of our own agricultural requirements at home with family farming and create a healthy, safe environment there. I mean, that's a big need that we have. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about.
Yeah, I like that approach. I love that approach. It's just like, let's deal with the fact that we have structurally dangerous bridges that are on the verge of collapsing and 80-year-old pipes transporting our water. We can all agree that's dangerous. Let's start working on that. And maybe in 5-10 years, when we resolve these vital existential crises caused by neglect of our infrastructure, we'll revisit this question on what ideology will be animating the overarching emission of credit and new greenbacks and what have you. Good approach. Very good approach.
I lived in a town not too long ago where they told me I was doing some work, and our sewers are made of cardboard. It's going to cost millions of dollars to replace it. Well, okay, that's a good place to put your money.
Yeah, and you're going to build, obviously, if you do it, you're going to discover pretty quickly we don't have any competency to process the concrete and make whatever type of equipment or machine tools are needed to build that infrastructure, make that fix. So that's going to create a demand for all of a sudden a native, like an actual American company to be rebuilt, people to be trained to do the job. Yeah, it makes sense.
We've given all that away. We've thrown it all away for the big money guys, and that's got to be turned around.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think that the military-industrial complex could also be maybe retooled to build infrastructure instead of building bombs? It seems like that's one of the last residues where we have some industrial capacity. Maybe that could be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And that would also mean right? Yeah, I mean, they said that World War II was like an engineer's war, and that the type of, it was before the military-industrial sort of the revolution in military affairs. when you were training soldiers to build a bridge, as well as, if need be, destroy a bridge. But today it's like we lost that idea of the engineer force and the citizen army. Like that's gone. Last minute, how would you like to end out the last thought as a parting idea for viewers?
Be confident. Be confident in yourself and your ability to adapt, to learn, to get control of your own resources, and just go forward with joy in your heart.
Words of wisdom from Richard Cook. Pick up his book, Our Country Then and Now, on Amazon, 400-year journey through America's history. And be sure to follow American Geopolitical Institute on veterans, VT, foreign policy. So thank you so much, Richard, for sharing this, and looking forward to more conversations in the future.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate it.
All right, stay tuned for TNT's Connecting the Dots next week, where we join you again with more fun guests. Take care.